Hi everyone, welcome to Draftscapes. I'm Chris Tuccio. In this video, we're going to continue to look at ground textures, specifically focusing on stone and water features for your landscape design plans. Stick around. Okay everyone, so today we're going to start actually without any guides whatsoever, and we're going to draw just freehand a few different types of textures, specifically focusing in on stone and water. So the first thing that we're going to do is just a standard flagstone pattern. So I'm just going to write flagstone here, and I am using, again, my drafting pens. I'm using a 1.0 Copic multiliner. I have some other tools that I'll just link in the description below. But for flagstone, there's really two different ways that we can draw it. We can do it with spacing for joints or without. But the key to flagstone essentially is an irregular, fairly flat stone like such. It doesn't follow any ordinary patterns like you would for brick or some sort of concrete paver. But when you're doing flagstone, typically you have this joint spacing in between the units themselves. Now, depending on the size of the plan that you're drawing and the particular scale, the 1.0 marker might be a little thick. You can see it's a kind of a thick line, but I want to make sure that it's showing up here. You could go all the way down to 0.3, but that's really minute. When you're doing these types of textures, what you want to try and focus in on is having some larger pieces, some medium pieces, and some small pieces, and have them linked together to form the pattern itself. So one edge ends up defining the other to get the material texture of the flagstone. And depending on your design, you can draw these spacings of these joints however large you would like them. Now, they're not all irregular shapes. Some of them might have flat sides, some of them might not. But it's actually better to draw them in unison. So some small, some medium, some large. Together, it gives you a more natural look than drawing all the large ones and then trying to connect them with pieces of smaller ones. When you're doing sort of bounded lines, you could form one edge like I did here, where you have a defined line. Maybe this is the edge of a walkway, and then you can bleed it out into the other area. So you go from left to right or right to left, whatever's more comfortable. And you sort of just work your way through the pattern. I particularly like having the spacing for the spacing of the joints between the stones themselves. I think it looks a little more natural, but you don't have to. I'll show you another way of doing this. Now, once you're done with that, you could come in with a smaller pen. So this is my 0.5, and I could start to stipple in between the joints themselves. So it adds a little bit of texture in the joints, and this can add a nice effect. Maybe it's some sort of moss or gravel that you have in between the stones. And then, if you like it like this, you can leave it. But remember, flagstone isn't necessarily always a very smooth stone. You sometimes have markings on the stones themselves. So I like actually marking up a few of the stones, giving them some texture. Not all of them, but a few of them. And then some of the smaller ones actually doing sort of like a little hatch pattern, like you see there. Gives it a nice natural look, like so. So that's the first way you can do flagstone. Another way you can do flagstone, if I just move it over just a little bit, is I can create almost like a stained glass pattern. Some people prefer this, and with this pattern, I don't actually have any joints whatsoever. I just have the edges of the patio. So this is for maybe if you're like grouting in between the pieces of flagstone so that it's a completely impermeable surface for your stone texture. You can do something like this. Again, I think it's a much more natural and nicer look to do it the other way, but some people do prefer doing stone the way I'm showing it here. And so you can see it creates this almost stained glass look to the edge. And then I could come back and I'm just going to do flagstone 1, flagstone 2, so you get 2 pieces. And because you don't really have any of the interior joints like you do here, you do want to come in this instance and mark up some of the interior pieces, just to give them some depth. Perhaps they have some rounded edges, some stipples. And you could leave a couple blank themselves. So you have one with joints, one without joints. I think they both look pretty well. Another type of stone texture that's kind of nice that people like working on is ashlar. Okay? Now an ashlar pattern is a sort of a rectangular stone pattern where you have, again, large, medium, and small, but they're typically thinner, square stones. For this, you could use, I have like an inking triangle next to me. You could definitely use a straight edge for this, but because it's stone, I actually prefer doing it freehand. You know, you can kind of get the hang of how to do this, where you're just drawing a rectangle like so, and you're obviously having not really defined edges because it's stone, so your natural tendency to move your pen is actually going to make it look a little more realistic. And so you have, let's say, one nice long thin one, a couple small ones, and then maybe a nice large square one. And then you can have a nice longer thin one underneath that, and then maybe a smaller square one, and a longer thin one. Okay, and you could move in and do this kind of ashlar square pattern. And here it's a much more refined look than flagstone. But it still remains realistic. And I could do this both again as a regular jointed, so I have space between the joints where I might put some sort of sand or moss, or I can have it be stained glass like the look I showed you before. Okay, and then if I was to do that now, I'm going to come in again and stipple in between the joints. Giving a nice aggregate look. And for this, instead of sort of marking up with stipples and some lines of flagstone to make it more natural, I'm actually going to come in and I'm going to really hatch a couple of them. And I'm just going to come in and I'm going to hatch a few of them with some wispy lines. This is a 0.5 again, the smaller marker. Just adding a little bit of a hatch to them. That one I'm just going to do a little. Give it a more natural look. I'll add a little more on this one. And there we go. Okay, so a nice ashlar pattern. Okay, so now we have 3 different ways to do stone. The next one we're going to do is sort of just boulders or sculptural stones. Maybe some larger garden rocks that we want. So I'm just going to put boulder. So perhaps you have a garden where you have some plant material, but you want some larger stones to be sort of sculptural pieces within the composition. With these, typically you want to draw them in odd numbers, large, medium, small in 3s, or you can go to 5 or 7 depending on how many you want. But for this, what you want to do is first kind of have an overall view of what the stone might look like from above. Kind of maybe like a octagon that's kind of pushed in on the side. And then you have another one that's just a medium one. And then you can have a small one like so. And again, I was using the 0.1 there. And then you come in with your smaller, finer marker and you add these little striations as if they're the little edges of the boulder themselves. So from the top, it's like a little shadow that's being cast. And same thing for the smaller ones. And then from there, you could then stipple out from those stones to add depth. If you wanted to, you can also hatch underneath them for the purposes of adding shadow. I like the stippling instead. As it bleeds out, it gives the impression of a shadow, but it's not as heavy-handed as a hatch. Okay, and then this edge is just a little light, so I'm going to darken it up just a little to define it a little more. Now this is a much more sort of rigid. I'm using straight lines here, but you can also do this same type of pattern but rounded out. So perhaps I have more rounded stones. Again, that might be more of a rounded look. Rounded look. And rounded look. But again, I have a hierarchy, an organizational structure. Large, medium, small. It makes it look much more natural. And if I wanted to add a couple smaller ones, I could. So then I come up again with my 0.5. And I'm just, same kind of thing I'm doing here, except I'm doing it with rounded looks, rounded lines. Make them seem as if they're a little more natural. And then I can come and hatch in. So these can be stones that are large, that people can sit on, or perhaps they're just meant to be little eye catchers within your garden. Okay, so that's some simple bouldering. And then finally, we'll play with adding water kind of to these elements. I'm going to move my triangle here. So let's say that I have sort of a water element, a little kidney-shaped water feature. Like so, like a little figure-8 asymmetrical pond. Now this is a little off the page, so I'm going to move it up a little. So if I had something like this, and I wanted to add a water texture to it, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to come around very similar to how I did these boulders, and I'm going to work my way in, almost in concentric circles, to form the edge. So I'm trying to add depth, so it's going to be pretty heavy with lines around the edges, and then I'm going to fade them out in between. So do something like this. Imagine as if a stone was to hit the center of the pond and it would ripple out, but we're only seeing the ripples around the edge to define them. And you don't want to be too heavy-handed here. Less is often more. A person can kind of get the idea of water without you having to draw every little last ripple. And so then, if you wanted, you can come in and sort of stipple the edge just a little bit. And this can give the impression now of a nice little water body. And you could come back and add areas of plant material or even stones. So perhaps I have a stone here, a large boulder. Maybe I have another one over here. Okay, and I can come in and add a little texture. Same thing here. Maybe these are some stones. Then I could stipple around this edge as well. Perhaps I have some sort of tree on the side here, so I don't have my circle template on me, so I'm going to just rough hand some sort of tree. Okay, and then put maybe a couple small ones next to it. Okay, and so then I have this idea of creating a little water feature in a specific area of my garden. Just by doing the overall boundary and then some ripples around it can really make a nice look. And so this is just a standard texture of doing water. Now, when you do these, they're all just simply binary colors. They're just black and white. So if you add hints of blue, hints of green around the stone, flecks of grayish tones within the stone themselves, it'll really make the line weights pop. So you want to play around with that either in color pencil or with your markers as well. Okay, so again, some quick ways of doing some different textures. Again, keep practicing at it, and I'm sure in no time you're going to be drafting these just from memory really easily. Okay, so I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you at the next video.